Welcome to the Deep 404. I want to talk today a little bit about some of the Western propaganda around the ATACMS missiles and the decision by Joe Biden to allow Ukraine to use these long-range missiles. Overnight reports are that some of these missiles have been fired into Russia. They were used immediately, maybe 5 or 6 of them. Russian reports are that 4 of them at least were shot down. Another one was disabled or knocked off course. It did explode on the ground but missed its intended target, whatever that target may have been. I just wanted to show you what the bulk of the West is seeing on the mainstream media channels and then go through and analyse a little bit of that. So I'll just start with a video here. This first one is of Retired General Barry McCaffrey. Let's just play this. Hopefully you can hear it.
First, your reaction to the Biden administration's decision on these long-range missile strikes into Russia with U.S. weapons and how that changes the dynamics of this conflict.
Well, I think it was a smart move. They're giving an advantage to Ukraine that might help in the negotiation process after the Trump administration takes office. They're responding to a massive and probably increasing presence of North Korean troops in Russia who are now taking part in an attack. There's 10,000 so far. The speculation is there'll be more than 100,000 North Koreans. And then, of course, the Iranians have provided a massive number of airborne missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles to attack Ukrainian civilian targets. So it's a desperate situation. The Russians are desperate. They've had 700,000 potential killed and wounded so far in the war. But at the end of the day, Joyce, it's too little, too late. It's a political gesture. It won't make a significant change on the battlefield.
And what do you think the likely targets would be with these missiles on the part of Ukraine?
Well, earlier it was reported by some pretty knowledgeable sources that the Pentagon insisted on approving each target. So that will drastically change the decision calculus to the Ukrainians. The obvious first attempt is to get all those sites that are firing missiles at Ukraine's civilian electrical infrastructure, the water, people. They're using DPICM, individual submunitions, against marketplaces and hospitals.
All right. I think that's a good taste. Let's just go through some of the things that General Barry McCaffrey mentioned there. One of them, 700,000 Russian killed and wounded. Now, this is an interesting number. I'd like to know where he gets it from. Probably from the British intelligence, which comes directly from the Ukrainians. I've done a couple of videos in the past talking about this where I've done some calculations. If you use the Media Zona, which appear to be about the only organisation that's doing any real analysis into Russian deaths, where they are scouring obituaries and looking at cemeteries, looking at military reports of people who have been killed in the battle, they come up with a far, far lower number, somewhere around the 40 or 50,000 for possible killed Russian soldiers in this conflict. Now, there have been periods of time when the Russians early on in the conflict were outnumbered by the Ukrainians, but that hasn't been the case for a long time. And for a very long time, the Russians have had what you would consider to be almost complete air superiority, an overmatch in terms of artillery pieces and actual ammunition for the artillery. The Russians have had an ongoing ability to supply deep missile strikes and drone strikes into Ukraine, which Ukraine has not been able to match. So this suggestion that 700,000 Russians have been killed and wounded here, if we assume it is true, then you must assume that the Ukrainian numbers are far, far higher than that. Reports that I'm seeing on Telegram these days are talking about 7-to-1 kill ratios at the current time. That meaning that for one Russian loss of a soldier, there are 7 Ukrainians lost. Obviously, I'm not on the front line. I can't confirm that. But as I say, when you stack up the benefits, the advantages that the Russians have over the Ukrainians, you logically come to a position where the Ukrainians must be sustaining many more losses than the Russians are. So that's the first one. An interesting number that he's chosen there. Then the North Korean issue. Now, Retired General Barry McCaffrey is suggesting that there are 10,000 frontline North Korean troops in the Kursk region battling against the Ukrainians. In another video that I saw from him yesterday, he believes it's 20,000. And he speaks of it going up to 100,000 is what the US intelligence believes there will ultimately be, 100,000 North Korean troops. Where on the video where I've stopped it here is where is similar footage to where he was mentioning this. And if you watch the footage when he was mentioning the fact that the North Koreans were there, it's interesting that there's no footage provided of North Korean troops fighting in Russia or the Kursk region. And if you look at Telegram or X or YouTube or wherever, there is no footage of the North Koreans fighting in Kursk and in this battle because they're just not there. As I've said in previous videos, there will be some North Korean military personnel in Russia. I'm certain of that. They have a military agreement. They will be helping the North Koreans understand modern warfare by having observers there. But 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 frontline troops, there's zero evidence for this. The economy is in a shambles, he mentions. Look, this is an interesting topic, and I get a lot of people challenging me on this. The Russian economy is not in a shambles. What you have to understand is that the Russian economy is not like a Western economy, like the economy of Germany or the economy of the United States, for example, for a number of reasons. One reason, due to the sanctions that have been placed upon the Russians are finding it tough to purchase overseas goods. The Russian ruble has declined against the US dollar. However, these things don't have a big impact on the actual economy and the quality of life of the people living in Russia. Domestic production has increased dramatically because of those sanctions, which forbade all of the Russians from having their money overseas, or the concern that they had about it being seized. They pulled their money out of Western banks and sold Western properties, and that money is now being invested domestically in Russia. So the domestic production of goods is increasing there. So people are able to get the goods that they want, producing them locally in Russia or through their close connections with China. They're able to purchase all of those Chinese goods that you get from Temu and Wish and Alibaba and AliExpress, all of those sort of websites. The Russians are able to get these things from the Chinese. The dollar. The ruble. So yes, people go on about the economy has crashed because the ruble's weak against the US dollar. This isn't a problem for the Russians. The Russians aren't trading in US dollars anymore. They're avoiding them. This is a big part of what BRICS will cement in the future. But already the Russians are trading their major deals between countries like India, Brazil and China in local currencies, in Chinese RMB, in rubles, in the Indian rupee. So the value of the ruble against the dollar is only a problem for you if you're looking at buying lots of things in dollars, which they're not, because they're not buying American goods. As I said, they're buying domestic goods now to a large extent. Russia has moved to a war footing, so they are working hard out on producing for the war. And what this means is they have a labour shortage. Now, this labour shortage means that everyone is working in Russia, so they have inflation. Again, different inflation to the inflation that we tend to have in the West, where we have supply-side inflation. We have problems with getting products. We have shortages of products. Russia is a resource-rich nation. Russia has a demand-side inflation problem. They have a problem with inflation, yes, because of government spending, because of their spending on the military, but also partially because everyone is working and is making money, is fully employed, and therefore has the ability to spend. So they have different challenges there. The economy is not in shambles. He also goes on to say that Trump and JD Vance want to hand over the war to Putin. Now, General McCaffrey is on MSNBC speaking, or one of their affiliates here, and he is an MSNBC military analyst and contributor. So no reason that his position... so that's a good reason why his position is that Trump and JD Vance want to hand the war over to Putin. I haven't seen anything indicating that at all. All I've heard is that Trump wants to speak to Putin and wants to negotiate an end to the conflict, wants to find a way for it to stop, which sounds like a sensible idea. He also mentions that the Russians are using cluster munitions on markets and hospitals. I haven't seen any evidence of this. I have, during this conflict, seen a number of cases of where there have been missile strikes on apartment blocks and marketplaces and churches, and they have been claimed by the Ukrainians to be Russian strikes. And then when video footage has come out and images have come out, what has been shown are the telltale signs of air defence missiles that have gone off course and exploded. Things like multiple small tiny pockmarks over the side of a church, which come from the fragmentation explosion of a air defence missile. Not the sort of damage you would expect to see from an Iskander or a hypersonic missile or something which is a high explosive missile. Damage is done to churches where there is a hole through the roof and then there is all this pockmarking inside. These are the telltale signs of air defence. There was no evidence of the Russians using cluster munitions on markets or civilians. So his main justification for this is the fact that this is to stop the North Koreans, which aren't there. And then on the point of long-range ATACMS, the benefits of it, he's suggesting that it might give an advantage to Trump in negotiations in the future. But then finally he says, it's too little too late. It's just a political gesture. So I've got to question his analysis here. He seems to be basing the reason for why he considers this to be a good idea on a whole heap of unsubstantiated reports, number of Russians killed and wounded, number of North Koreans in the conflict, Russia using cluster munitions on civilians and hospitals. And maybe he thinks that by doing this, it might give an advantage to Trump in negotiations. I'm questioning the validity of this. This sounds a lot like propaganda to me. I've got another video here we'll just go to, and this is from another retired general. I thought about speeding this up because he's a very boring man, but let's just listen to it.
New weapons or authorities by themselves are not game-changing. Nonetheless, this is still a positive step. I would anticipate that the Ukrainian General Staff will use these to target Russian headquarters, logistics, and artillery. Now, that's how you defeat mass, and mass is the only advantage that the Russian forces have, the big numbers. And so if you can destroy the headquarters that are necessary to coordinate their movements and their support, if you can destroy the artillery that enables their attacks, and if you can destroy the logistics that provides the artillery ammunition, then I think you can really degrade the effectiveness of Russian, these mass attacks. That's what I expect the General Staff will do.
Again, great analysis from Retired General Ben Hodges. All that the Ukrainians have to do with these ATACMS is destroy all of the HQ, all of the logistics, all of the artillery. There's been a war going on for 3 years. I assume they've been trying to do that, and they are losing in doing that. Having a few ATACMS missiles is not going to allow them to do that. The only Russian advantage, he suggests, is the big numbers that they have. Now, this is true. This is an obvious advantage the Russians have had right from the start. And one of the reasons where it has been very obvious, if you've looked at this conflict and tried to decide who would be likely to come out on top, that Russia would be if it was a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which it is in terms of the men on the ground. So Ukraine, a population of about 37 million before the war started, has that's now reduced to probably somewhere around 27 million thereabouts. A lot of people have left. A lot of people have died. So the big numbers, yep, that's definitely one. The Russians have a population of 140 million people. Just as an indication, that 140 million people in Russia is roughly equivalent to the population of Ukraine, Poland, and Germany combined. So this is just something to think about. If you're taking the approach that, NATO should get into war with Russia, full war with Russia, well, Russia can straight away compete with those three nations just purely in terms of the numbers they've got. Putting aside things about the production capacity that Russia has for weapons, the experience their army has, and the desire, the impetus that they have to fight, given that they would be in an existential crisis if they were fighting all of NATO. But anyhow, Ben Hodges doesn't think that having air superiority over the Ukrainians. Remember, the Ukrainians were given F-16s. Have you heard much about them of late? One was blown up on the tarmac on day one. After that, there's been nothing. It's because they are unable to get them into the air. This is also a challenge around the use of things like the Storm Shadows and the Taurus and the Scalp. They need to be launched. Su-24s are the launch platform that the Ukrainians have been using. The Russians have been hunting those. We haven't seen many of these being used of late, and it's because to get the longer range out of the longer versions of them, you need to get your aircraft up high. The higher you get them, the further they can launch them, and that, of course, puts them in range of all of the Russian air defences. So he doesn't mention that as being an advantage. He doesn't mention the weapon systems that the Russians have that the Ukrainians don't have, like the TOS flamethrowers, which are so effective in large area attacks against personnel. Things like that he doesn't mention as being an advantage. The overmatch in terms of the artillery and the ammunition for artillery is also not something that he mentions as being an advantage. Just one more video from Ben Hodges, just a quick one.
But as I reflected on this all day yesterday, this is actually a gift from the Biden administration to the Trump administration to have this policy in place so that then the Trump administration can just leave it or use it as a point of increased leverage against the Russians or not.
So, agreeing here with Retired General Barry McCaffrey that the advantage here is that this might give a point of leverage to Trump or not. This is quite staggering, really, when you think that these are retired generals from the American Armed Forces, senior people that were in positions of power. I've got to wonder, are they just completely politically biased against Trump, or are they completely brainwashed and just uninformed and only looking at MSNBC for their news? The point of this being a benefit to Trump in negotiations is really an invalid one. When it comes time to negotiate, if the Americans are in the negotiations, or if they've already stepped out, if Trump has decided to step out before then, it is left to the Europeans and the Ukrainians, then it's not such a great benefit. If Trump is still there, then it's insignificant. It's not a bargaining chip. If Ukraine had, in their 2023 offensive, managed to cut through to Tokmak and get to the Sea of Azov and cut off Crimea, and they had held Crimea, that would be some form of a bargaining chip where you could say to the Russians, look, we'll give you Crimea back if you give us back everything else, whatever it might be. Saying that, we're going to fire long-range ATACMS missiles at you is not a bargaining chip in negotiations. So really, it's interesting that both of these generals here have said that these weapons are not game-changing. What they need to do with them is exactly what they need to do for the last 3 years, which is destroy all the Russian HQ, logistics and artillery, which they're unable to do. We know that the ATACMS aren't going to do that. The Russians are already quite capable of shooting them down. There's no logic here. This is just propaganda being spewed out to the masses because someone somewhere wants to keep this fight going. And given that Biden has just done this, and Biden has always been the big hawk on Ukraine, you've got to wonder what benefits Biden himself and the Biden family and his associates are getting out of the Ukraine conflict. I don't have any details on this, but you could speculate that perhaps it's somehow enriching him. And look, the whole decision of Biden to do this is not to provide additional leverage for Trump. Reportedly, there was no communication between Biden and Trump to discuss authorizing the long-range use of American missiles against Russia. So it's not like he said to Trump, hey, I want to work with you, I want to hand this over to you and help you. This is going to help you in bargaining with the Russians in the future. There was no discussions. It was done by Biden as a spiteful move to put Trump into a difficult position where, as Trump tries to get out of Ukraine, which he has said that he will do and he wants to do, he now has to go through the political turmoil of winding this back and saying, no more long-range strikes on Russia. Now, as soon as he does that, the war hawks and the Democrats will come crashing down on him and saying, you're weak on Russia, we'd done this for you, we'd helped you with this, look at you, you've just thrown it away, you're Putin's puppet. Expect to see all of this nonsense in the future. What I'm really seeing here from these two is that they can't accept that Russia is no longer an insignificant world power. They can't understand or accept that Russia has grown in strength over the last 3 years by moving to a war footing and using its resources. They've got to make up these fictitious accounts of 10, 20, 100,000 North Koreans fighting in Kursk. And that's why the Kursk adventure failed. Not because some Russians have stopped it and pushed back the Kursk offensive. And the Kursk offensive by the Ukrainians has been a complete disaster. It's achieved nothing tactical, nothing strategic. It has just cost the lives of tens of thousands of Ukrainian men. And look, this is what this is. This is just pure propaganda. All right, I will talk to you again soon.